John King's was the kind of man people envied. At 45 he stood tall and confident, his presence commanding attention wherever he went. As one of the wealthiest oil billionaires in Lagos, he had built an empire from scratch, navigating the competitive industry with brilliance and charm. His name was synonymous with power, respect, and endless luxury. His home, a sprawling mansion in Enkay, piece of modern architecture. Glass walls allowed sunlight to pour into the vast open spaces, illuminating marble floors and designer furniture. A private elevator connected the mansion's 3 floors, and every room was a testament to wealth. Custom paintings, rare sculptures, and high-tech gadgets filled the space. John loved his home, but what he cherished most was the woman who shared it with him. Evelyn, his wife of 10 years, was stunning. Her beauty was timeless, the kind that turned heads and left lasting impressions. Her smooth caramel skin glowed effortlessly, and her laughter was like a melody, filling their home with warmth. To John she was more than his wife, she was his world. They were the perfect couple, or so it seemed. Their days were filled with love and joy. Mornings began with laughter over breakfast in their glass-walled kitchen overlooking the lagoon. Evelyn often teased John about his meticulous nature, and he'd respond with a playful grin, pulling her into his arms. They enjoyed evenings together, hosting lavish parties, where Lagos elites admired their chemistry. Together they seemed unstoppable, a force of love and success. John spoiled Evelyn endlessly. She had a custom wardrobe filled with the finest clothes, a collection of rare jewelry, and even a sleek electric car that he had imported just for her. Yet it wasn't just material gifts, he was attentive and thoughtful, always surprising her with handwritten notes or small gestures that showed how much he cared. Evelyn appeared to adore him just as much. She would lean into his embrace at public events, her soft gaze full of admiration. She loved the lifestyle they shared. Exclusive trips to Dubai, shopping sprees in Paris, and yacht parties in the Mediterranean. They seemed to have everything, and from the outside, their life was nothing short of a fairy tale. But fairy tales often hide secrets, and there were whispers in Evelyn's heart that even John's generosity couldn't reach. She loved her husband, or at least she thought she did, but something was missing. As much as she tried to ignore the quiet yearning for more excitement, it was always there, lingering in the shadows of her perfect life. John, oblivious to these whispers, remained confident in their love. He believed that he had given Evelyn everything she could ever want. He adored her more than words could express, and the thought of her being unhappy never crossed his mind. Their happiness was amplified by the city they called home. Lagos was alive, a city that never slept. The vibrant energy coursing through its streets mirrored the passion in their relationship. Skyscrapers rose high into the sky, and luxury cars zoomed past sprawling markets and high-end boutiques. The city was both chaotic and glamorous, a perfect reflection of their seemingly charmed life. As the sun dipped below the vibrant city, casting hues of orange and pink across the sky, John frequently occupied the balcony of their mansion with Evelyn beside him. They would gaze at the city lights springing to life, enjoying a bottle of wine while discussing various topics, both significant and trivial. Those moments felt endless, as if the universe paused just for them. Little did John know, the life he treasured so deeply was already beginning to crack. The whispers in Evelyn's heart were growing louder, and the perfect picture he had painted of their love would soon be shattered. For now, though, the love and joy remained, a fragile facade that shielded John from the storm that was about to engulf him. John's mornings always started with a routine: a hot cup of coffee, a glance at the stock market, and a kiss on Evelyn's cheek as she prepared her schedule for the day. It was a ritual that anchored his life, a symbol of their harmony. But lately something had changed. Evelyn's once effortless laughter felt strained, her smile too fleeting. "Everything okay, love?" John asked one morning as they sat in their sunlit kitchen. Evelyn looked up, startled, as if pulled from her thoughts. "Of course," she said with a quick smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Why wouldn't it be?" John didn't press. He wanted to believe her, but the nagging feeling in his gut said otherwise. A few weeks later, John attended a gala hosted by one of Lagos' top business magnates. Evelyn had insisted she wasn't feeling well and stayed home. Alone at the event, John mingled with Lagos elite, exchanging pleasantries and discussing business. As the evening wore on, he overheard snippets of conversation that made his ears prick. I saw her last week at the Palm Lounge, one man said, lowering his voice. She was with a young guy. Not her husband, that's for sure. Ah, Lagos women, his companion replied with a knowing chuckle. They always find their fun no matter how rich their men are. John's heart pounded. He wanted to believe it was just idle gossip, but the seed of doubt was planted. Could they be talking about Evelyn? No, he told himself. Not his Evelyn. Days turned into weeks and John began to notice things he hadn't before. Evelyn spent more time on her phone, her face lighting up with smiles she didn't share with him. She started going out more frequently, always with vague explanations about charity meetings or spa appointments. One evening, as they sat together in their expansive living room, Evelyn's phone buzzed. She picked it up quickly, her body tense. John, sitting across from her, watched as her lips curled into a soft smile at whatever message she was reading. "Who's that?" he asked casually, though his voice carried an edge. "Oh, just Ada," she replied without looking up. "She's planning a birthday party and wants my input." John nodded, forcing himself to believe her. But deep down, unease gnawed at him. He started paying closer attention to Evelyn's behavior, noting every odd detail. Then came Moses. Moses Adebayo was a rising star in Nigerian politics, young, ambitious, and charismatic. At just 32, he had captured the hearts of many with his bold promises and undeniable charm. He was everything Evelyn seemed to admire: confident, passionate, and exciting. John first heard Moses' name during a casual dinner with friends. "Evelyn seems to know him well," one of the women said, her tone light but suggestive. John's ears perked up. "Moses? The politician?" "Yes," she replied, sipping her wine. "I saw them at an event last month. They seemed friendly." John didn't react outwardly, but inside his mind raced. Friendly? What did that mean? He dismissed it as harmless chatter, but the doubt refused to leave him. One evening, John's suspicions were confirmed in the most devastating way. Evelyn had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she stepped out to the garden. A message notification flashed on the screen, and John's curiosity got the better of him. He picked up the phone, his hands trembling as he read the text. "Moses, can't wait to see you tonight. Same place?" The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His mind reeled, his chest tightening with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Evelyn returned moments later, and John quickly put the phone down, masking his emotions. But something in him had shifted. That night, as Evelyn slept peacefully beside him, John stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. He couldn't ignore the truth any longer. His wife, the woman he had loved and trusted with everything, was having an affair. Over the next few days, John's world began to unravel. He watched Evelyn closely, noting every call, every message, every late-night outing. The evidence piled up, each piece a dagger to his heart. He saw her laughter, the kind that used to belong to him, now reserved for someone else. One evening, unable to contain his rage, John confronted Evelyn. "Are you seeing someone else?" he asked bluntly, his voice trembling. Evelyn froze, her eyes widening. "What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," John said, his tone sharp. "Don't lie to me, Evelyn." Her silence was answer enough. Evelyn looked away, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "It's not what you think," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. John laughed bitterly. "Not what I think. Do you take me for a fool?" Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes, but she said nothing. For the first time in their marriage, John felt like he was staring at a stranger. The days that followed were filled with tension and unspoken words. Evelyn tried to carry on as if nothing had happened, but the distance between them was palpable. John, meanwhile, was consumed by anger and betrayal. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything but the affair. The image of Evelyn with another man haunted him, a constant reminder of his shattered trust. One evening, as he sat alone in his study, John made a decision. He wouldn't let this betrayal go unanswered. If Moses thought he could steal from him, take what was rightfully his, then he had another thing coming. The storm was brewing and John was ready to unleash it. John Kings was a man transformed. The gentle, loving husband who once adorned Evelyn with devotion had been replaced by someone he barely recognized. Rage simmered beneath his calm exterior, threatening to boil over at any moment. It wasn't just about Evelyn's betrayal anymore. It was about Moses. The young, ambitious politician had taken what John held most dear, and the thought of it filled him with a searing anger. John began to obsess over Moses. Late at night, while Evelyn slept in the room next door, he pored over information about the man. Moses was everywhere. His face on billboards, his speeches broadcast on television, his name in newspaper headlines. John hated him, but he couldn't deny the magnetic charisma that had made Moses so successful. That charm was the same thing that had drawn Evelyn in, and the realization made John's anger even harder to contain. But John wasn't content with just stewing in his emotions. He wanted answers. He wanted to know every detail of their betrayal. He started tracking Evelyn's movements with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He hacked into her phone, reading every message, listening to every whispered voicemail. He even hired a private investigator to follow her when she left the house. What he found confirmed his worst fears. Evelyn and Moses met regularly, often at a luxury boutique hotel in Victoria Island. Their meetings were discreet but not invisible. The investigator sent photos of them together. Evelyn laughing as Moses held her hand, their heads bent close in intimate conversation. Each image was like a knife twisting in John's chest. One evening, Evelyn returned home late, her face flushed with excitement. She barely glanced at John as she walked past him, heading straight to their bedroom. John followed her, his hands clenched into fists. "Did you have a good time?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. Evelyn paused, her back to him. "What are you talking about? You think I don't know?" John's voice rose, the anger he had been suppressing finally spilling over. "You think I haven't seen the pictures? Heard the calls? I know everything, Evelyn." She turned to face him, her expression a mix of guilt and defiance. "John, don't you dare try to explain this," he snapped. "You betrayed me. You lied to me." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. What could she say? The truth was out and there was no way to take it back. After that confrontation, something inside John snapped. The love he had once felt for Evelyn was now overshadowed by bitterness and betrayal. He couldn't look at her without seeing Moses. He couldn't hear her voice without remembering the whispered words of love she had shared with another man. John became consumed by his desire for revenge. He wasn't just angry, he was humiliated. Moses had made a fool of him and John wasn't going to let him get away with it. He began to formulate a plan, a dark and twisted scheme that would ensure Moses paid for his actions. He started by reaching out to Moses under the guise of a business opportunity. Using a fake name, John sent an email expressing interest in selling one of his lesser-known properties, an old workshop on the outskirts of Lagos. The property was worthless to John, but he knew it would serve his purpose perfectly. It was isolated, rarely visited, and the perfect place for what he had in mind. To his satisfaction, Moses responded eagerly. The young politician was always on the lookout for opportunities to expand his portfolio, and he didn't suspect a thing. They arranged to meet on a stormy Friday evening, when the streets would be quiet and the city's attention elsewhere. As the day approached, John's anger only grew. He could barely sleep, his mind racing with thoughts of what he would do. He wasn't a violent man by nature, but the betrayal had awakened something dark within him, a part of himself he didn't know existed. The night of the meeting, the weather matched John's mood. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and rain lashed against the windows of his car as he drove to the workshop. He carried with him a small golden statue, a gift Evelyn had once given him. It felt fitting to use it as a symbol of their broken love. When Moses arrived, he looked completely at ease, his usual smug confidence on full display. He didn't recognize John at first, but the moment their eyes met, the truth dawned on him. "John," Moses said, taking a cautious step back. "What's going on?" John didn't answer. He locked the workshop door behind them, his movements slow and deliberate. The room was dimly lit, the shadows dancing across the walls as the storm raged outside. "You took something from me," John said, his voice low and menacing. "Now it's time to pay." Moses tried to talk his way out of it, his words stumbling over each other as fear took hold. But John was beyond reason. He raised the golden statue and brought it down with all his strength. The impact was sickening and Moses crumpled to the floor, lifeless. John stood over the body, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The rage that had consumed him moments before was now replaced by a chilling calm. He felt nothing, not regret, not guilt, not even relief. It was as if all the emotions that had driven him to this point had been burned away. He pulled out a container of petrol he had brought with him, pouring the liquid around Moses' body. The smell was overpowering, but John didn't flinch. He struck a match, the small flame flickering in the dim light. "You took what was mine," he whispered, his voice devoid of emotion. He dropped the match and the fire roared to life, consuming everything in its path. As the flames reflected in his eyes, John felt a strange sense of finality. The man he had been was gone, replaced by someone darker, colder, and unrecognizable. The fire roared to life, consuming the darkness of the abandoned workshop with a sinister glow. Flames licked at the walls, casting distorted shadows that danced like vengeful spirits. The storm outside seemed to mirror the chaos inside, lightning flashing through the shattered windows and thunder shaking the foundations. John stood motionless, watching as the inferno devoured the lifeless body of Moses. The golden statue he had used to strike the fatal blow lay discarded on the floor, its polished surface smeared with blood. The air was thick with the acrid stench of petrol and burning flesh, yet John barely noticed. His face was eerily calm, devoid of the anguish and fury that had driven him to this point. "You took what was mine," he repeated under his breath as though the words were a mantra. For a brief moment he felt victorious. Moses was gone, reduced to ash and nothingness. The man who had dared to steal his wife, his pride, and his happiness would never haunt him again. But the sense of triumph was fleeting. As the flames consumed the evidence of his crime, John's thoughts turned inward, and a chilling realization began to settle in. There was no going back. The drive home was a blur. Rain hammered against the windshield, and the rhythmic swish of the wipers did little to clear John's vision. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. The adrenaline that had coursed through him earlier was fading, replaced by a numbing emptiness. The man he had been, the devoted husband, the respected billionaire, was gone. In his place stood someone he didn't recognize, a man who had crossed a line he never thought possible. As he pulled into the driveway of his mansion, John sat in the car for a moment, staring at the glowing lights of the house. It looked so serene, so untouched by the chaos he had just unleashed. Evelyn's car was parked neatly beside his, a silent reminder of the woman who had started it all. For a moment he considered driving away, leaving everything behind and disappearing into the night. But where would he go? What would he do? This was his life, and no matter how broken it was, he couldn't abandon it. He took a deep breath, wiped his damp face with trembling hands and stepped out of the car. Inside, the house was quiet. Evelyn was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book. She looked up as John entered, her expression neutral. "You're back late," she said casually, her tone giving nothing away. John nodded, avoiding her gaze. "Had some business to take care of." Evelyn studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You're soaked. You should change before you catch a cold." John muttered something incoherent and headed upstairs. In the safety of his bathroom, he stared at his reflection in the mirror. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost, or become one. As he peeled off his wet clothes and stepped into the shower, the events of the night replayed in his mind. The confrontation, the blood, the fire, it all felt like a nightmare. But it wasn't. It was real. He had killed a man, and no amount of hot water could wash that away. The next morning the news broke. Breaking news. Fire at abandoned workshop. One body found. John watched the television in silence as a reporter described the scene. The charred remains of the workshop had been discovered early that morning by a passerby. Authorities were investigating, but the identity of the victim was yet to be confirmed. Evelyn entered the room, glancing at the screen. "That's terrible," she said, shaking her head. "Who do you think it was?" John shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Probably some homeless person." Evelyn frowned but said nothing more. She seemed distracted, her mind elsewhere. John watched her closely, searching for any sign of guilt or suspicion. But Evelyn was an enigma, her emotions carefully hidden behind a mask of indifference. As the days passed, John found himself unraveling. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, suffocating him. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything but the fire and the lifeless body of Moses. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the flames, heard the crackle of burning wood, and smelled the acrid stench of death. Evelyn, meanwhile, seemed unbothered. She carried on as if nothing had happened, her laughter and smiles as hollow as John's silence was loud. They were two strangers living under the same roof, their marriage reduced to a facade. One evening as they sat together in the living room, Evelyn's phone buzzed. She picked it up quickly, her face paling as she read the message. John noticed her reaction and leaned forward. "Who's that?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. "Just a friend," Evelyn said, putting the phone down. But John didn't believe her. He couldn't help but wonder, did she know? Had Moses told her about their meeting before he died? Was she hiding something from him just as he was hiding something from her? The mistrust between them grew, an invisible wall that neither of them dared to breach. John thought killing Moses would bring him closure, but instead, it had opened a door he couldn't close. The fire that had consumed the workshop hadn't just destroyed Moses. It had destroyed a part of John as well. He was a man haunted, not just by his crime but by the knowledge that the woman he had killed for wasn't worth it. Evelyn's betrayal had shattered him, but his own actions had finished the job. He was no longer a man of power and respect. He was a shadow, a ghost, a hollow shell of who he had once been. Days turned into weeks and the weight of what John had done grew heavier. The headlines about the fire at the abandoned workshop slowly faded, but they remained a permanent fixture in his mind. He couldn't escape the vivid memories of that night. The flames, the smell, the lifeless body of Moses. It clung to him like a second skin, a constant reminder of the darkness he had embraced. Evelyn, oblivious to the storm raging inside John, went about her life as if nothing had changed. She attended charity events, met with friends and kept up appearances. But John knew her better than anyone and he could see the cracks. There was an unease in her eyes, a hesitation in her voice when they spoke. She was hiding something and John couldn't shake the feeling that she knew more than she let on. One evening as they sat at the dining table in near silence, Evelyn spoke. "John," she began, her voice soft, "is everything okay?" John looked up from his barely touched plate, his expression unreadable. "Why do you ask?" "You've been distant," she said, searching his face. "You barely talk to me anymore." John chuckled bitterly. "Funny coming from you." Evelyn flinched, her fork clattering against her plate. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," John said, his voice cold, "that you don't get to play the victim here. Not after everything you've done." Evelyn stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. John, I don't lie to me," he snapped, slamming his hand on the table. "I know about you and Moses. I've known for a long time." The color drained from Evelyn's face. She opened her mouth to speak but no words came out. The truth hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Evelyn eventually found her voice. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I was lonely, John. You were always so busy, so consumed with your work. I felt invisible." John stared at her, his jaw clenched. "So you decided to find comfort in someone else?" "In him." "I made a mistake," she whispered. "I'm sorry." "Sorry?" John repeated, his voice rising. "You think sorry fixes this? Do you have any idea what you've done to me?" Evelyn sobbed, but John felt no sympathy. The betrayal was too deep, the wounds too raw. The following days were a haze of tension and mistrust. Evelyn tried to mend the broken pieces of their marriage, but John refused to let her in. He couldn't look at her without thinking of Moses, couldn't hear her voice without remembering the lies. The home they had built together became a prison, each room echoing with the ghosts of their love. Meanwhile, the investigation into the fire continued. John watched the news obsessively, waiting for any mention of Moses. When the police finally confirmed the identity of the victim, his heart nearly stopped. Authorities have identified the body found at the scene of the fire as Moses Adebayo, a prominent young politician, the anchor announced. Police are treating the case as suspicious and are urging anyone with information to come forward. John turned off the television, his hands shaking. The walls were closing in, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the truth caught up with him. Evelyn's reaction to the news was subtle but telling. When she heard about Moses' death, her face went pale and her hands trembled. John watched her closely, searching for signs of guilt or suspicion. "Did you know him well?" he asked, his voice laced with accusation. Evelyn hesitated. "Not really," she said, avoiding his gaze. "We crossed paths a few times, that's all." John didn't believe her. He could see the fear in her eyes, the way she avoided his questions. She knew something, but she wasn't saying it. And yet, Evelyn wasn't the only one hiding secrets. John's own guilt was a constant presence, gnawing at him like a festering wound. He couldn't sleep without reliving that night, couldn't close his eyes without seeing Moses' lifeless body. The fire he had lit had consumed more than Moses. It had consumed John's soul. One night, unable to bear the silence any longer, John confronted Evelyn once more. "Do you know what happened to Moses?" he asked, his voice trembling. Evelyn froze, her eyes wide with fear. "Why are you asking me that?" "Because I think you know," John said, stepping closer. "I think you know more than you're letting on." Evelyn shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "John, please. Tell me the truth," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. But Evelyn said nothing. She simply stared at him, her silence louder than any confession. Their marriage, already fractured, crumbled completely after that night. Evelyn withdrew into herself, avoiding John whenever possible. And John, consumed by his guilt and paranoia, became a shadow of his former self. The luxurious life they had built together became a hollow shell, devoid of love, trust, or joy. In the end, they were both prisoners. Evelyn, trapped by the weight of her betrayal, and John, haunted by the darkness he had unleashed. The city of Lagos, with all its vibrancy and chaos, carried on around them, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding within their home. John had sought revenge, but instead he had destroyed everything he held dear. He was left with nothing but sadness and mistrust, a man consumed by the consequences of his own actions. As he sat alone in the darkness of his study, staring at the golden statue that had sealed his fate, John realized the bitter truth. In trying to punish Evelyn and Moses, he had only punished himself. And there was no turning back.